Hello and welcome to this tutorial on working with data row objects using Labelbox's Python SDK. A couple things to keep in mind first and foremost. Data rows are the assets or items that are actually being labeled in Labelbox. A data row is a member of a data set and must be a member of a data set as it can't exist otherwise. And data rows are added to projects by first attaching them to a data set and then attaching those data sets to projects. I've gone ahead and installed the necessary dependencies and packages here, as well as set a dummy project ID for this demonstration from my own organization. I've also entered my API key and established my client. In this cell here, we're going to grab our project and set it as the project variable here using client.getProject. And then we're also going to call upon the relationship between project and data sets and ask for the first data set in that paginated collection, which this relationship will produce. So now I have data set to that first data set that's attached to this project. In this cell here, I'm going to grab the first data row in this data set. So again, I'm calling upon a relationship here, and that being the relationship between the data rows in this data set. And I'll use next to grab this first data row. And in this cell here, I'm going to ask to view the relationship between data row and data set. So that is, which data set this data row is in. Ask to view any labels that have been made on this data row. And we'll view the first one of those labels by calling next. And then we're going to ask to see a field that's associated with this data row. And that field would be the external ID field. So if I run this cell here, we can see the associated data set and all of its information, including its UID and its name. We can also see the labels associated with this data row that have been made on this data row. So here we see the schema ID for the objects in this label, and we can also find information like seconds to label, and then here's the label ID in the UID field. And lastly, we're going to print one of these fields that's in this label object, and that's the external ID. So here the external ID is this screenshot title. In this next cell here, we'll demonstrate the data row for external ID method on a data set. And using this method, we can pass in a specific external ID and grab that data row. So here we're just going to re-grab this original data row by passing in its external ID. And if we run this cell and then print this data row, we can see the data row information, which is the same data row information if we ask for data row right here. And we could view some of the fields on a data row. So here's external ID, its media attributes like width and height, the row data, which is typically a signed URL, its UID, and various other associated fields. Next, we'll walk through how to create an individual data row. So the first thing we'll do is create a new data set called testing data set. And then we're going to call dataset.createDataRow, and we'll need to pass in row data. And in this case, it will be a random photo generated by Pixum. And it's also recommended that we pass in an external ID, although it is optional. And these external IDs are useful for users to maintain internal references in their own org. So they're an external ID because they're external to Labelbox, but for you as a customer, they might be internal. So we'll go ahead and run this cell. And we'll jump over to the UI to see what's happened. So after refreshing my browser and navigating to the Datasets tab, I can see my most recently created dataset is this testing dataset. And there are two data rows populating this dataset, which are the two data rows I've created in line 2 here and in line 6. Next, we'll go over a few different techniques for creating data rows in bulk, which will be a much faster approach than creating individual data rows. First, we can call dataset.createDataRows, plural, and here we will pass in a list of dictionaries, and in each entry in this dictionary, we will need a datarow.rowData value. So here, it's again this Pixum link to generate a random photo. We have our first data row that we're creating here, and our second one right here. and then we close the list, and we can run this task. In this notebook, we'll set each task up first, and then we'll run them all at the end. Additionally, we can use a local data path. So I have this file test data row text file with information in it, in which I'll write sample data. And again, I can pass this local data path in a list here into create data rows. We'll set up this task now. I can also, as shown in task 3 here, in my list, pass both this dictionary of data row objects and a local data path. So I can combine both task 1 and task 2 in my list as long as I set it up correctly. And then lastly, let's note that you cannot set external IDs when uploading from a local file. So at this time, to do that, you would need to set an item URL from your local data path, and then you pass this URL into the dictionary object as the row data value. And then again, using our unique ID generator, we can create an external ID and pass it in as data for the value for the key data row dot external ID. So I'll run task 4 here to set it up. And now if we run all 4 of these tasks, calling wait till done, and then we ask to print the status, we'll see here that each task should run successfully. And then we'll hop over to the platform to see what this has done. So after refreshing my browser, we can see that there have been 3 data rows created from that sample text file, which simply just had sample data written in it. And then also we've added 3 more images from Pixum. And keep in mind, Pixum we simply use for demonstration purposes, as it will generate a new photo every time the link is asked to be a reference point for an image. So these are the original 2 we uploaded, but the image has changed. And then 3 more from these tasks we've run. And then we ran that local file path 3 times over the course of those 4 tasks. So here's all the data rows we just created in each of those separate tasks. We can also call the update method on a data row and then clarify a field for which we want to update. So here in this cell, I create a new ID using our unique identifier generator. And then I call datarow.update on that same original data row object we had set in cells above. And I'm setting its external ID to a new ID. So if I run this cell, we see that the data row external ID now matches this new ID we've generated. Here we asked to print both the external ID for the data row and what that new ID I created in line 2 was. So now they match thanks to our update method. Additionally, we can programmatically create attachments on a data row by calling the create attachment method. And the 2 arguments we'll need to pass into this method are the type of attachments and the attachment value. So here we're adding a text attachment, and the value of that text attachment will just be labelers will see this. So if I run this cell here, we'll then hop over to the UI to see what's happened. Here the asset attachment ID has been printed out for reference when we run this method. And keep in mind, you can always reference our docs to see the various types of attachments that you can add to a data row. Let's jump to the platform. So I've gone ahead and searched for the data set from which that data row object we had been working on in the Colab exists in. And if I open the data row, I can see here in the UI that I have a text attachment on this data row. And if we want to view what this text is, its labelers will see this. So if this data row is included in a project, labelers working on the project can open the attachments and they'll see that text attachment. So in many cases, as you can imagine, this will be used for instructions or visual instructions or HTML or a link to something that may be helpful for the labeling job. So let's hop back to the Colab. Finally, as with all our database objects, I can delete an individual data row. So I'll run this cell and that will delete the data row for which we've just been working. And additionally, I can bulk delete a list of data rows. So what we'll do here is we'll just delete all the data rows in the data set in which we just created. So now that we've run these two cells, we'll hop back to Labelbox platform and see what's happened. After refreshing my browser, as we can see here, there's no longer a data row in the GraphQL dataset creation dataset, which I've been using for this demo. And I'll go ahead and search for the dataset we created. And here's the dataset, testing dataset, for which we had 8 data rows we had created. And after I ran that bulk delete method, there's no longer any data rows in this dataset. So we didn't delete the dataset itself, rather we just deleted all the data rows. So now we have an empty dataset. That's all for this tutorial. Thanks for watching.